Ah, you wish to understand the Liber Necris? How quaint. This tome, a gateway to immortality, speaks of Nagash's dark reign and the mortuary cult's forbidden rites. But beware, mortal. Knowledge here is a double-edged sword. Seek it only if you dare face the price of eternity. The tale of my kind finds its roots many thousands of years ago, before the coming of the man-god Sigmar and the founding of his empire in a land far to the south, beyond the petty kingdoms of border princes and the ancient hold of Karak Azul. Referred to as Ta Uritharhain by the Asur and Grimaz Angkor by the Dawi, the so-called scholars of Sigmar's realm reference this distant land only as the kingdom of the dead. If death truly has been defeated by the likes of my kind, which mark you, it most certainly has been. There is no place that the long battle to achieve this immortality began other than the kingdom of the dead. There is an amusing irony in this, for this land was the cradle of human civilization, and its true name was, and is, Nehekara. Not many can speak of Nehekara with authority. Few mortals have reached that now desolate land, and of those that have, fewer still have returned to tell the tale of their travels. There is only one mortal that I know of who has walked the length and breadth of Nehekara and has returned to speak of it. He was reviled by his own people as a heretic and madman upon his return. Such is the predictable stupidity of mortal men, unable to see the rare visionary standing amongst them like an unheeded shepherd surrounded by a mindless flock. The visionary of whom I speak was an Arabian prince by the name of Abdul ben Rashid, ben Musad, ben Osman, the great sheikh of Lost Bel Aliad, son of the shifting sands, and lord of the Malaluk desert. He alone beheld what no other mortal had for millennia before even the birth of the man-god Sigmar. Driven by the cruel passion of his curiosity and the pitiless momentum of destiny, Abdul ben Rashid wandered the lands of ancient Nehekara for 8 long years, recording all he saw within the masterpiece that he could not bring himself to name, but which history has named the Book of the Dead. It is to the few surviving copies of this great poem in blank verse that the scholars of the old world owe their hazy knowledge of ancient Nehekara. When they broke down the door, they found only his purple-faced corpse. His body was said to have been so chill to the touch that it burned the hands of those who tried to lift it. Terrified by these events and ignorant of the great value of Ben Rashid's work, the Caliph of the eastern city of Kasabar ordered all copies of the prince's book to be found and burned. Fortunately for history and seekers of wisdom, the Caliph was not successful in his destructive ignorance. Copies survived in the private collections of nobles, too ignorant to realize the identity or worth of the book they owned. In time, the zealous knights of the empire, Tilea and Bretonia, declared their crusade against the lands of Araby, and amongst the loot they brought back from their foolish escapade were copies of the Book of the Dead, though I am sure many of these knights came to regret their decision. Ben Rashid's book speaks of a great desert to the east of Araby, from which rise thousands upon thousands of necropolies of all shapes and sizes, the crumbling echoes of the most ancient of all human civilizations. There are many lesser copies of the book, most of which have new facts added and with originally sublime turns of phrase, altered by the dim imaginations of lesser historians and poets. I include here several stanzas of the original unaltered work that I myself have translated. In that dread desert, beneath the moon's pale gaze, dead men walk. They haunt the shifting dunes of the breathless, windless night, brandishing weapons of bronze in mocking challenge and bitter resentment of the life they no longer possess. And sometimes, in ghastly dry voices, like the rustling of sun-baked reeds, they whisper the one word they remember from life, the name of the one who cursed them to their existence of more than death, but less than life. They whisper the name, Nagash. As is often the way of such things, Ben Rashid did not live to see the widespread horror inspired by his work. Whether it was because he sought to emulate some of the dangerous arts he beheld while upon his travels, or whether he was cursed simply by witnessing all he had, the prince died under mysterious circumstances, strangled while locked within a shuttered room. When his servants eventually broke down the door, they found only his purple-faced corpse. Though in our time the land of Nehekara is a wilderness of lifeless sand, and the great river that runs through it is deadly poisonous, and both the color and texture of sour blood, It was not always so. It is true that the cities are empty of life, crumbled ruins on the edge of the great necropolis. It is true that the roads have long been buried by the shifting sands, leaving only a few toppled statues and wind-eroded monuments to mark their presence. The few travelers who have returned from this desolate land speak only of emptiness and the terrible fear and melancholy that filled their hearts. It is true that the land is lifeless now, but it was not always so. I know, for I have walked all the paths that Ben Rashid trod before me, and I have seen and learned all that he had seen and learned, and much, much more. 3 millennia before the time of Sigmar, a civilization grew up along the banks of the great river Mortis that scholars of ancient times named the Vitae. 500 years later, this civilization found itself fully realized as the kingdom of Nehekhara. At a time when most other humans throughout the world were little more than savages, the people of Nehekhara had learned to cultivate the land and herd oxen and goats, and they had built cities, ships, and roads. Greatest of all their achievements, this most ancient of all human civilizations had developed a sophisticated written language, the foundations of which, so their legends say, were first taught to them by the gods themselves. Gods who walked amongst their children millennia before the Nehekharans had built their first road. The proud and strong people of Nehekhara conquered the wandering tribes of the desert, imposing their culture and beliefs upon all they met, unifying them into a great nation and binding them as citizens or vassals of their great city-states. From this, the Nehekharans then drove the tribes of orcs and goblins far from their lands, until all the plains, deserts, and mountains, from the western deserts to the eastern sea, were subjugated by the disparate city-states of the great Nehekharan civilization. At the very height of their powers, the influence of the Nehekharan rulers stretched from the steaming jungles of the Southlands, up along the coastline of the Bitter Sea, and around the much-fabled Dragon Isles, across the dark lands through the World's Edge Mountains to cover all the Badlands and the region now called the Border Principalities, and as far north as Sylvania. To the west, the Nehekharans controlled or else had frequent access to settlements across all of the lands of Araby, Tilea, Estalia, and Bretonia as far as the mutable borders of the Loran Forest. Never has there been one human civilization as wide-ranging and pervasive as that of ancient Nehekhara. Not even, or so I believe, the greatest empire of the distant Orient, ruled over by the Dragon Emperor who sits upon the jade throne of Grand Cathay. Just as it remains to this day, the greatest by far of all the ancient cities of Nehekhara was Eternal Khemri. And it was the first recorded king of this great city, Setra, called the Imperishable, who defeated the monarchs of the other city-states and brought all Nehekhara under his rule and the dominion of Khemri. There are countless temples, palaces, and necropoles scattered throughout Nehekhara that mention King Setra, both praising and condemning him in equal measure. He was, by every account, a great warrior and masterful general, a leader without peer in his time, though also a bloody-handed tyrant to all who dared question his rule. Setra was also a vain and bitter man, despising his own mortality and the fact that despite all his mighty victories and temporal power, death would one day rob him of everything he had won. So it was that Setra embarked upon his greatest and lifelong campaign. One I think aptly demonstrates the fundamental terror of all humans since the dawn of time. In his pride and arrogance, Setra vowed that death would never claim him or his works, and he ordered his priests to find a way to ensure his immortality upon this plane of existence. For Setra saw no good reason to leave it and cared nothing for an afterlife in some spirit realm where he would be subservient to the gods and their servants. An understandable desire if ever there was one. The priests of Nehekhara were much more than the pale and brutal priests of Sigmar's empire in this age. They were the holders of secrets passed on to humanity by ancient, and I believe now long-dead gods. They were holy men, alchemists and sorcerers, masterful physicians, surgeons, apothecaries, and demonologists, able to bind minor demons, or jinn as the Nehekharan priests called them. At Setra's command, the ancient priests of Nehekhara bent all their considerable skills to the task their king had set them. For decades, they experimented with flesh-preserving compounds of chemical and magic, and also communion and interrogation of jinn, and, or so it is said, the gods themselves. Throughout these years, the priests of Khemri uncovered many secrets and made many great advances in alchemy and the delaying of time's ravages. Ultimately, the greatest secret of them all, that of immortality, remained ever just beyond their grasp.